Thomas had not slept properly in the last 72 hours, not because of the physical exhaustion of the long journey, but because, after 15 years away, coming home felt more terrifying than anything he had ever faced in his entire life. He gripped the steering wheel of his imported luxury sedan, feeling the soft, expensive leather under his trembling fingers as he stared through the windshield at the rolling hills of Nebraska. The wooden sign at the edge of the road, weathered by years of prairie winds, read, "Welcome to Willow Creek." That name still carried a sharp ache in his chest, a mixture of nostalgia and a deep, pulsing guilt that he could never quite shake. 15 years had passed since he had walked away from this place, with nothing but a single backpack on his shoulders and a solemn promise on his lips. He had told his parents he would find success and come back to rescue them from the dust and the struggle of their small-town life. Martha and Gerald deserved so much better than this forgotten corner of the American Midwest, where everyone knew everyone else's business and gossip traveled faster than a summer thunderstorm. Thomas was only 19 years old when he left, fueled by ambition and the desperate need to escape the cycle of poverty that had gripped his family for generations. Now he was 34, driving a car that cost more than 5 houses in this county, wearing a watch that felt heavy on his wrist, and carrying a secret that was about to change everything they knew about the world. 3 weeks ago, he had won the state lottery. It wasn't just a small prize or a modest windfall that would make the local news for a day, and it was $15 million, paid out in a single lump sum, no installments and no complications. When the clerk at the lottery office confirmed the winning numbers, Thomas hadn't jumped for joy or shouted in triumph. Instead, he had collapsed onto the floor and wept like a terrified child, feeling a sudden, overwhelming wave of relief. Finally, he would be able to find his parents, pull them out of their meager existence, and give them everything they had ever earned through their decades of sacrifice. He envisioned a grand house, a table overflowing with fine food, new clothes, the best private doctors, and a life of absolute peace. For 15 years, he had sent money home every single month without fail. In the beginning, it wasn't much because he was working as a lowly security guard in Chicago, and his meager salary barely covered his own rent and groceries. But as he climbed the corporate ladder, moving from supervisor to manager, the amounts he sent home began to grow significantly. For the last 5 years, he had been sending at least $2,000 every month. He did it religiously, every 10th day of the month, ensuring the money hit the account like clockwork. Thomas had always imagined his parents receiving those transfers with smiles on their faces, using the funds to renovate their old farmhouse, buy fresh groceries, and live with the dignity they deserved. However, a nagging problem had begun to eat at him about 6 months ago. His parents never called to say thank you, they never sent a letter of acknowledgement, and they never reached out with news of their lives. At first, he convinced himself it was just their humble nature, that they didn't want to seem greedy or overly indebted. But eventually, the silence became deafening. He had sent letters that went unanswered. He had tried to send messages through a neighbor, but those attempts were met with a wall of silence. He even tried calling the local general store, asking the owner to fetch Martha to the phone. But the woman who answered told him coldly that Martha didn't live near there anymore. That was when the fear truly took root in his soul, clenching his heart like a frozen fist. How could they not live there anymore? Where could they possibly have gone? Thomas tried calling the old house, but the number had been disconnected years ago. He even reached out to his Aunt Valerie, his mother's sister who had always lived in the neighboring town of Lincoln. Valerie had answered the phone with a voice like ice, sharp and dismissive, claiming she knew nothing about their whereabouts before hanging up on him. It was incredibly strange, for while Valerie had always been a bit arrogant and social climbing, she had never been the type to hang up on family. So, Thomas decided he had to return. With his lottery winnings, or without them, he had to discover the truth, and the urgency of his new wealth only made the journey more vital. The car moved slowly down Acacia Street, the familiar lane where his childhood home stood. Thomas recognized every gnarled oak tree, every crack in the asphalt, and every rusted gate along the way. He passed Victor's house, which looked exactly the same as it had a decade ago, with the same old golden retriever napping on the porch. He passed Isabella's house, where the same floral curtains hung in the windows, looking as though they hadn't been washed in years. He passed Samuel's Market, which now sported a modern neon sign advertising digital payments and home delivery. And then he saw it. Thomas slammed on the brakes so hard that the seatbelt locked painfully against his chest. He sat there in the middle of the street, staring through the glass, unable to comprehend the sight before him. That couldn't be the house where he grew up. The white paint was peeling away in long, ugly strips, and the porch was sagging dangerously. The front gate was crooked, hanging by a single rusted hinge, and the yard, which his mother had once kept vibrant with roses and hydrangeas, and was now a waist-high jungle of weeds and dead grass. The windows were boarded up with rough planks of wood, and the roof looked as if it might collapse at any moment. It looked like a haunted house, a place abandoned by the living and forgotten by time. Thomas stepped out of the car, his legs feeling like jelly as they struggled to support his weight. He pushed the gate, and it fell to the ground with a dull thud, kicking up a cloud of gray Nebraska dust. He walked up the 3 steps to the porch, the very same steps where he used to sit with his father on Sunday afternoons to drink cold lemonade and talk about the future. The front door was locked tight, but looking through a gap in the boards, he could see that the interior was gutted. There were no furniture pieces, no curtains, no photographs on the walls. Just an empty, echoing shell of a life. "Hey, mister, what do you think you're doing over there?" A voice startled him, and Thomas spun around to see Chloe, the neighbor from across the street. She had always been a kind woman, but now she stood at her gate with her arms crossed, eyeing him with deep suspicion. "Chloe, it's me. It's Thomas, Martha's son," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. The woman's eyes widened, and she took 2 steps back, as if she were looking at a ghost. "Thomas? The Thomas who vanished 15 years ago?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Yes, I'm back. Where are my parents? What happened to the house?" Chloe's expression shifted instantly from shock to a complicated mixture of pity, anger, and disgust. "You have the nerve to show up here now, boy? And you have the courage to stand on that porch?" Thomas felt the world tilting on its axis. "Courage? What are you talking about? I came to find my parents. Where are they?" Chloe stepped closer, her voice rising to a near shout. "You disappear for 15 years. You don't send a word of news. You don't send a single cent of help. You leave those poor old souls to rot in misery. And now you show up in a fancy car asking where they are? You should be ashamed of yourself." Thomas felt the ground give way beneath his feet, a sickening sensation of vertigo wash over him as he stared at Chloe. "What do you mean I didn't send money? I sent money every single month for 15 years. I have the records to prove it." He was shouting now, his voice echoing off the quiet houses of the neighborhood. Chloe let out a sharp, bitter laugh that sounded like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "Lies. It was your Aunt Valerie who looked after your parents all these years. She was the one who paid their bills. She was the one who bought their groceries, and she was the one who bought their medicine when they fell ill. You didn't send a damn thing, Thomas. We all saw it. We saw the struggle they went through while you were living it up in the big city. Thomas felt his stomach churn with a mixture of confusion and burgeoning rage. Chloe, I swear to you, I sent the money. I have the receipts in my bag. I can show you every transfer. Receipts can be faked by anyone with a computer, boy, Chloe snapped, her eyes narrowing with disdain. I saw the truth with my own eyes. I saw Gerald out there on the streets, picking up aluminum cans and scrap metal just to buy a loaf of bread. I saw Martha taking in laundry from the people on the other side of town, scrubbing clothes until her knuckles bled, just to scrape together a few dollars for electricity. You weren't here. Nobody knew where you were until Valerie finally had to take action because they couldn't survive on their own anymore. Thomas felt a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. What action did she take? Where did she take them? Chloe pointed toward the far edge of town, toward the industrial district where the land turned gray and the air smelled of exhaust and waste. She took them to a place they could actually afford, far away from here because this house was literally falling down on top of them. They had no money for repairs, no money for taxes, nothing. Where, Chloe? Tell me exactly where they are, Thomas demanded, his voice desperate. The woman turned her back on him, walking toward her own front door. Down by the old landfill. There's a row of shacks down there near the tracks. But if I were you, I wouldn't go. You don't have the moral right to show your face to them after what you've put them through. Thomas stood there alone on the cracked sidewalk, feeling as though his entire world had been demolished in a matter of seconds. Near the landfill? Shacks? It made no sense. He had sent $2,000 a month. In a small town like Willow Creek, that kind of money went a long way. It could pay for a comfortable rental, healthy food, new clothes, and still leave plenty for savings. Where had all that money gone? He stumbled back to his car, his hands shaking so violently he could barely fit the key into the ignition. He roared the engine to life and sped toward the outskirts of town, his mind racing through 1,000 terrifying possibilities. 10 minutes later, Thomas pulled up to a scene that shattered his heart into 1,000 jagged pieces. It was a desolate stretch of land where the town's refuse was piled high, and the wind carried the acrid scent of burning trash. There, tucked against a rusted chain-link fence, were 5 or 6 makeshift dwellings constructed from scrap wood, rusted corrugated metal, and heavy black plastic tarps. Barefoot children played in the dirt, their faces smudged with soot, and women stood over plastic basins, washing clothes in murky water. It was a scene of absolute grinding poverty that seemed out of place in the middle of America. And there, in the very last shack on the left, he saw them. Martha, now 72 years old with her once vibrant hair turned entirely white and pulled into a messy bun, was sitting on the hard-packed dirt floor of the shack's entrance. Beside her sat Gerald, 75 years old, his once strong back now curved into a permanent slouch from years of back-breaking labor. They were sharing a single dented aluminum plate, eating slowly with plastic spoons. It was a meager meal of watery white rice and thin, flavorless beans, with nothing else to accompany it. They chewed each bite with a careful, deliberate focus, as if every single grain of rice was a precious treasure they couldn't afford to waste. Thomas stepped out of his luxury car, but he couldn't even manage to take 2 steps forward. His legs simply locked up, refusing to move. So he retreated behind a withered, leafless tree, hiding his expensive clothes and his grief, and he began to cry. It was a deep, guttural sobbing that he hadn't experienced since he was a small boy. Those were his parents, the people who had given their lives to raise him, who had gone hungry so he could eat, who had slept on the floor so he could have the only bed in the house. And now they were living like outcasts, eating scraps in the shadow of a landfill, believing that their only son had abandoned them to this hell. Thomas watched from behind the tree as they finished their meal. Martha picked up the aluminum plate and rose slowly, her movements stiff and pained, as if every joint in her body were screaming in protest. She walked to a rusted faucet that was dripping slowly in front of the shack and rinsed the plate with her bare hands, using no soap, only the cold water. Gerald leaned against the rotting wooden wall to haul himself up, breathing heavily as he adjusted a tattered baseball cap to shield his eyes from the setting sun. It was late afternoon, and the Nebraska sky was turning a brilliant, mocking shade of orange and pink. But here, in this place of forgotten souls, even the sunset couldn't hide the pervasive sadness. Thomas wiped his eyes with his sleeve, taking 3 deep breaths to steady his racing heart. He made a sudden, firm decision. He wouldn't reveal who he was just yet. He needed to understand the full scope of what had happened. He needed to uncover every layer of this deception before he exploded with rage. And if he went to them now, shouting and crying and hugging them, they would be overwhelmed, and he wouldn't be able to investigate the mechanism of this betrayal properly. He went back to the car, opened the trunk, and pulled out one of the expensive designer suits he had bought after winning the lottery. He changed right there behind the car, swapping his casual clothes for a crisp white dress shirt, tailored black trousers, and Italian leather shoes that gleamed even in the fading light. He slicked his hair back with gel, put on a pair of dark sunglasses, and looked at himself in the rearview mirror. He looked like a different person entirely. A wealthy businessman, a high-level executive, someone his parents would never recognize as the scrawny teenager who had left 15 years ago. He grabbed an executive briefcase from the back seat. He took one more steadying breath and began the long walk toward the shack. His heart was beating so loudly, he was certain they could hear it. Each step on the dry earth bringing him closer to a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to face. "Good afternoon," Thomas said, stopping about 3 meters away from the entrance of the shack. He had deepened his voice, adopting a more formal, detached tone that sounded nothing like the son they remembered. Martha looked up at him, her eyes widening in alarm, while Gerald turned slowly, squinting through the glare. People dressed like this never came to this part of town. When they did, it usually meant trouble, an eviction notice, a debt collector, or perhaps the police. "Good afternoon, sir," Martha replied, with the quiet, innate dignity of a woman who had never lost her grace, no matter how much the world had tried to strip it from her. "Can we help you with something?" Thomas felt his knees nearly buckle at the sound of her voice. It had been so many years since he had heard that soft, maternal lilt. It was raspier now, tired and aged, but it was still the same voice that had sung him to sleep and prayed for his protection every night of his childhood. The fact that she didn't recognize him was a sharp, jagged pain in his gut. I am a developer," Thomas began, struggling to keep his voice from trembling. "I'm looking for parcels of land to purchase in this area for a new project. I was told that you and your husband know this town better than anyone." Gerald let out a short, hollow laugh that lacked any real mirth. "Well, we know the town, sir, but we don't have any land for you. This little patch of dirt belongs to the city. They just let us squat here because nobody else wants to be near the trash." Thomas tightened his grip on the handle of his briefcase. "Have you lived here your whole lives?" Gerald shook his head. "No, We lived over on Acacia Street for 30 years, had our own house, paid for with the sweat of my brow, but things changed. Life took a turn we weren't expecting. Martha looked down at the dusty ground. Mister, you didn't come here to talk about land, did you? Because if you came here to mock us or make things harder, it's better if you just move along. We've had enough hardship for one lifetime. No, ma'am, I promise you. I just want to talk. May I sit for a moment? Martha looked at Gerald, and they shared one of those long, silent looks that only a couple married for 50 years can exchange. A conversation of the eyes where words are unnecessary. Gerald shrugged his thin shoulders, and Martha pointed to a small wooden crate near the wall. You can sit there, but we don't have anything to offer you. No coffee, no cold water. Just the tap out front. Thomas sat down on the crate, his expensive suit feeling absurdly out of place against the backdrop of poverty. His parents remained standing, leaning against the precarious wooden wall of their shack. Up close, he could see the devastating details he had missed from a distance. Martha was painfully thin, her face a map of deep wrinkles that hadn't existed 15 years ago. Her hands were calloused and scarred, and her dress was a patchwork of old rags. Gerald's spine was severely curved, and his skin was leathery and burnt from the sun. Mrs. Miller, may I ask you a personal question? Thomas asked softly. You may. Do you have any children? A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the small space. Martha looked out toward the horizon, watching the sky darken into a bruised purple. Gerald looked down at his feet and kicked at a small stone in the dirt. I had a son, she finally answered, her voice barely a whisper. Just one. Yes, but it's been a very long time since we saw him. How long? Thomas pressed. 15 years, she said, and Thomas felt as if a knife had been plunged into his chest. 15 years. That's a long time. Why hasn't he come back? Gerald sighed deeply, the sound rattling in his chest. Because he went to make a life for himself in Chicago. We always encouraged him. I told him to study and work hard and find success. We wanted him to escape this place. And did he succeed? Thomas asked. Martha gave a sad, flickering smile. We think so. He never came back. And they say people who make it big in the city don't like to look back at where they came from. They move in high circles, with wealthy friends and important lives. We understand. We're just simple people. We don't fit into that world. Thomas felt his soul breaking. But didn't he ever send news? Didn't he ever call or write? No, sir, never, Martha said, and her voice wavered for the first time. We waited. Oh, how we waited. Every time the mail truck passed the old house, I hoped for a letter. Every time the phone rang, I hoped it was him. But the years turned into a decade, and then more, and eventually, we realized he had just forgotten us. You really believe he forgot you? Thomas asked, his heart hammering. I don't want to believe it, Martha said, tears finally brimming in her eyes. I don't want to believe my boy could forget his own mother. But 15 years of silence. What else is there to think? Gerald stepped closer to his wife, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. My wife's sister, Valerie. She explained it all to us. She has a way of knowing things. She told us Thomas became very rich in Chicago, that he married a socialite and has a life filled with fancy parties and expensive cars. She showed us pictures on the internet, men who looked like him, living the high life. She said he was embarrassed by us, that he didn't want his new friends to know his parents were just poor folks from Nebraska. It hurt to hear, But Valerie was the only one who stayed. She's the one who looked out for us. Thomas felt his blood begin to boil. Valerie, that venomous snake, had poisoned their minds. She had stolen his identity and replaced it with a caricature of a cold, ungrateful stranger. "And the house you used to own on Acacia Street?" Thomas asked. Martha bowed her head. "We had to sell it, sir. The bills got too high, and there were so many debts we didn't even know we had. Back taxes, unpaid utilities, repairs that needed to be made. Valerie helped us manage the sale, but she said after all the debts were paid, there was nothing left. She's the one who found us this place. She calls it temporary. But we've been here 3 years now." "Valerie is a saint," Gerald added, his voice filled with a tragic, misplaced sincerity. "She brings us old clothes and sometimes a bag of groceries when she can spare it. If it weren't for her, we'd be living under a bridge. We owe her everything." Thomas felt a white-hot rage surging through his veins. Valerie had not only stolen the hundreds of thousands of dollars he had sent, but she had also stolen their home, their dignity, and their relationship with their only son. She had painted herself as their savior, while she was the very person who had cast them into the fire. "And if I told you," Thomas began, his voice low and controlled, "that perhaps your son never forgot you? What if I told you he sent money every single month, but someone else was taking it? What if someone intercepted every letter he wrote and every gift he sent?" Martha looked up sharply, her eyes searching his face. "What are you saying, sir? How could you know such a thing?" "It's just a hypothesis," Thomas said, his hands clenching into fists inside his pockets. "But think about it. Who would benefit from you being isolated? Who had access to your mail and your accounts? Who convinced you to sell your house and then claimed there was no money left?" Gerald shook his head stubbornly. "No, that doesn't make sense. Why would Valerie do that? She's family. She's Martha's own sister." "Maybe because she wanted the money for herself," Thomas countered. "Maybe she used that money to build that big house of hers in Lincoln. Have you seen her house lately?" Martha stood frozen, a flicker of doubt finally crossing her weathered face. She says she won that money through smart investments. She says she worked hard for it." Thomas stood up from the crate, his heart ready to burst. He couldn't play this game any longer. He couldn't bear to see the confusion and pain in their eyes for another second. He reached up and slowly removed his sunglasses, looking directly into his mother's eyes, then his father's. "Mrs. Miller, Martha, Gerald, I didn't come here to buy land. I didn't come here to talk about development." He felt a tear escape and roll down his cheek. "I came here because I've been looking for you for months. I came here because I'm the one who sent those letters. I'm the one who sent $2,000 every month for years. Mother, Father, it's me. It's Thomas." The silence that followed was deafening, a vacuum of sound that seemed to suck the air out of the small shack. Martha stared at him, her mouth slightly open, her eyes darting across his features as if she were trying to overlay a memory onto the man standing before her. Gerald took a stumbling step back, leaning heavily against the wall for support. They were in total shock, their minds unable to bridge the gap between the wealthy stranger and the son they thought they had lost to the cold indifference of the world. "Thomas?" Martha whispered, the name sounding like a prayer. "My boy?" "Yes, Mom, it's me," Thomas said, his voice breaking. Gerald shook his head in disbelief, his eyes clouding with confusion. No, it can't be. Our son doesn't wear suits like that. He doesn't drive a car like the one down the road. He doesn't look like a millionaire." "I changed, Dad. 15 years in the city changed me, but I never stopped being your son. I never stopped trying to take care of you. Oh, everything Valerie told you was a lie." Martha began to sob, great racking gasps that shook her frail frame. "But we never got a word, not a single word in 15 years. "Because she was stealing them," Thomas shouted, his anger finally spilling over. "She stole every letter I wrote and every penny I sent, and I can prove it right now." He reached for his briefcase and ripped it open, spilling a mountain of documents onto the dirt floor of the shack. He began to sort through them with frantic energy, spreading out bank statements and wire transfer receipts like pieces of a tragic puzzle. "Look at this. January 2010, $200. That was all I could afford back then. February, another 200. Every single month, Dad. Look at the dates. Look at the recipient's name." Martha knelt on the ground, her hands trembling as she picked up one of the papers. She read the names and the dates over and over again. But this never came to my account," she whispered. "Because she gave me the wrong account number," Thomas explained, his voice thick with fury. "She told me it was your account, but look at the number. It's her account, Mom. She just changed one digit so I wouldn't notice. I've been sending money to her for 15 years, thinking it was going to you." Gerald knelt beside his wife, picking up a handful of the receipts. His eyes grew wide as he began to mentally calculate the sheer volume of wealth that had been funneled away from them. "Thomas, this adds up to more than $300,000. $342,000, Dad," Thomas confirmed, his voice cold with a lethal kind of clarity. "That is the amount of money I sent to make sure you were comfortable, to make sure you had the best of everything. And that woman took it all while she watched you rot in this dump." Martha collapsed onto the dirt, not from physical weakness, but from the sheer, crushing weight of the betrayal. 15 years of her life had been a lie. 15 years of mourning a living son. 15 years of hunger and humiliation, all orchestrated by her own sister. "She told us the house was falling down," Martha sobbed into her hands. "She told us there were debts we had to pay. She made us sell everything we owned and move into this plastic tent." Thomas knelt and pulled his mother into a tight embrace, feeling her thinness, the way her bones seemed to poke through her skin. "I never abandoned you, Mom, and I worked 3 jobs at a time just to send that money. I slept on a mattress on the floor of a basement so I could send more to you. I did everything for you." Gerald was shaking with a righteous fury that seemed to rejuvenate his old body. "Valerie, my own sister-in-law. She stole our lives. She made us believe our son was a monster." "It's worse than that, Dad," Thomas said, pulling out a bundle of yellowed envelopes from his briefcase. "Look at these. These are the letters I wrote. They were returned to me with stamps saying, 'Address unknown' or 'Recipient moved.' She must have been intercepting them at the post office or telling the mailman you were gone. She isolated you completely so she could keep the cash flowing into her pocket." Thomas slammed his fist into the dirt, his knuckles scraping against a hidden stone. "So she didn't just want the money. She wanted to destroy us. She wanted you to hate me. And she wanted me to think you didn't care about me. She wanted to be the hero while she was the villain." Suddenly, the sound of a car approaching drifted through the air. A sleek, silver SUV pulled up to the edge of the landfill, looking grotesquely expensive against the backdrop of garbage. A woman stepped out, dressed in a designer tracksuit with perfectly coiffed blonde hair and a gold watch that glittered in the sun. It was Valerie. She walked toward the shack with a fake, practiced smile, holding a small brown paper bag. "Martha? Gerald? I brought you some leftover bread from the bakery and some—" She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw the man in the expensive suit standing in the dirt, surrounded by piles of paper. Her eyes darted from Thomas to the bank statements on the ground, and for a split second, the mask of the benevolent aunt slipped, revealing a flash of pure, unadulterated terror. "Thomas?" she stammered, her voice losing its polished edge. "What are you doing here?" "I'm home, Aunt Valerie," Thomas said, his voice as sharp as a razor. "I'm home to see the life you built for my parents with my money. I'm home to see the shack you put them in while you're driving a $60,000 car." Valerie tried to regain her composure, her face twisting into a sneer. "I don't know what you're talking about. I've been the only one taking care of them while you were off playing big shot in the city." Thomas stepped forward, looming over her. "Really? Then explain these bank records. Explain why 15 years of my transfers went into an account you controlled. Explain why you told them I was ashamed of them." Valerie took a step back, her eyes darting around like a trapped animal. I was just holding the money for them. They're old. They don't know how to handle that kind of wealth. I was going to give it back when the time was right." "You were going to give it back?" Gerald roared, stepping out of the shack with a strength he hadn't possessed in years. "We were eating rice and beans while you were building a mansion in Lincoln. You stole our house. You stole our son." Valerie's face turned a mottled red, her pretense of kindness dissolving into pure, ugly spite. "You always had everything, Martha. The perfect husband, the smart son, the happy little house. I had nothing. I deserved that money more than you ever did. You wouldn't have known what to do with it anyway." The confession hung in the air, foul and heavy. It wasn't just greed, it was deep, festering envy that had driven her to commit such a monstrous act. Thomas didn't let her finish. He pulled his phone from his pocket and held it up. "I've been recording this entire conversation, Valerie. Every word of your confession is right here. And tomorrow morning, at 9 o'clock, we are going to meet at the county clerk's office. You are going to sign over the deed to your house to my parents. You are going to return every cent you have left in your accounts. And then, you are going to leave this state and never show your face to us again." Valerie let out a shrill, hysterical laugh. "You can't prove anything. It's my word against yours." "Is it?" Thomas asked, pressing play on the recording. Her own voice filled the desolate landscape, admitting to the theft and the envy. "If you don't do exactly what I say, this recording goes to the district attorney, along with 15 years of bank records and the testimony of every neighbor you lied to. You'll spend the rest of your life in a prison cell, Valerie. Is that what you want?" Valerie looked at the recording, then at the furious faces of the family she had tried to destroy. The fight drained out of her, leaving her looking small and pathetic. She turned without another word and fled toward her SUV, stumbling in the dirt as she went. Thomas watched her drive away, then turned back to his parents. Martha was still weeping, but now she was leaning against Gerald. And for the first time in 15 years, the shadow of a smile touched her lips. "Come on," Thomas said, his voice now gentle and full of love. "We're leaving this place. Right now." He helped them into his car, leaving the shack and the landfill behind forever. He drove them straight to the finest hotel in the county, a place of marble floors and soft music. The night at the hotel was a revelation. Thomas watched as his mother touched the high thread count sheets of the bed, her fingers tracing the fabric as if it were spun from gold. He watched his father stand under a hot shower for 20 minutes, letting the steam wash away years of grime and the heavy scent of the dump. Thomas ordered a feast to the room: thick steaks, roasted vegetables, fresh bread, and decadent desserts. As they ate, they talked deep into the night. He told them about his struggles in Chicago, the lonely nights, the hard work, and the final miraculous stroke of luck that had brought him $15 million. Martha and Gerald listened with wide eyes, holding their son's hands as if they were afraid he might vanish if they let go. "We're sorry we doubted you, son," Gerald said, his voice thick with emotion. "We should have known you'd never leave us like that." "There's nothing to apologize for, Dad. You were victims of a monster. But that's over now." The next morning, Thomas was waiting at the clerk's office at 9 o'clock sharp. Valerie arrived 10 minutes late, looking haggard and broken. She signed the papers with a trembling hand, transferring her luxurious property in Lincoln to Martha and Gerald Miller. She didn't look at any of them, and when the last document was stamped, she vanished into the morning fog, a ghost of a woman who had traded her soul for a pile of stolen gold. Thomas then took his parents to the local general store, the very heart of Willow Creek. The store was crowded with locals, including Chloe and Samuel. Thomas walked to the center of the room and cleared his throat, his voice commanding the attention of everyone present. "Listen to me! I have something to say to this town." The room went silent as he held up the bank records and the signed deed. "For 15 years, you all believed I abandoned my parents. You judged them, and you judged me based on the lies of a thief. Here is the proof that I sent $342,000 to my parents. Here is the proof that Valerie stole it all. And here is the deed to the house she built with that stolen money. A house that now belongs to my mother and father." A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. Chloe stepped forward, her face flushed with shame. "Thomas, we didn't know. We only saw what was in front of us." "Maybe you should have looked a little closer," Thomas said, but without malice. "But today is about the truth. My parents are moving into their new home today, and anyone who ever looked down on them or called them refuse is no longer welcome in our lives." He walked out of the store with his head held high, his parents flanking him like royalty. The transition into the new house was both a joy and a challenge. The property was a sprawling, 3-story Victorian-style home on the outskirts of Lincoln, surrounded by 5 acres of lush green lawn and ancient oak trees. It was a palace compared to the shack they had inhabited, but to Martha and Gerald, it felt like another planet. For the first few days, Martha would only sit in the kitchen, staring at the modern appliances as if they were alien artifacts. She was afraid to use the stove, worried she might break the gleaming granite countertops. Thomas spent hours sitting with her, showing her how the coffee maker worked, how to set the temperature on the oven, and reminding her that this was hers, that she didn't have to ask permission to live in her own home. Gerald was much the same, wandering through the vast garden with a look of utter bewilderment, his hands itching for the familiar weight of a shovel, but his mind still anchored to the scarcity of the landfill. Joe Thomas decided he needed to hire help, not because his parents were incapable, but because they had earned a season of absolute rest. He brought in a local woman named Sarah to help with the cleaning, and a young man named Peter to help Gerald with the landscaping. These two became part of the extended family, minor players in the grand restoration of the Miller name. Peter would spend hours listening to Gerald's stories about the old days of farming in Nebraska, while Sarah learned Martha's secret recipes for apple pie and pot roast. Slowly, the house began to feel less like a museum and more like a home. The cold, sterile atmosphere that Valerie had cultivated was replaced by the scent of baking bread and the sound of the radio playing old country hits. Thomas watched from the sidelines, his heart swelling with a peace he hadn't known was possible. However, the legal battle wasn't entirely over. Valerie, in a final act of desperate malice, had hired a high-powered attorney named Robert Sterling to challenge the transfer of the deed. She claimed that Thomas had used undue influence and emotional blackmail to force her signature. A week after they moved in, a process server arrived at the front door with a summons. Thomas felt the old rage bubbling up, but he forced himself to remain calm for the sake of his parents. He reached out to a respected lawyer in Lincoln, a woman named Diana Thorne, who specialized in elder abuse and financial fraud. Diana was a sharp, no-nonsense attorney who took one look at Thomas's evidence and smiled. "She has no case, Thomas. In fact, by bringing this to court, say she's only going to speed up her own criminal indictment." The town of Willow Creek was once again abuzz with the news. Some people, fueled by Valerie's lingering rumors, still whispered that Thomas was a bully who had used his new wealth to steamroll his aunt. It hurt to know that some people would always choose a juicy lie over a difficult truth, but Thomas realized he no longer cared about the town's opinion. His world was now contained within the 5 acres of that property. He focused on ensuring his parents had the best medical care. He brought in a specialist to look at Gerald's back and a nutritionist to help Martha regain the weight she had lost. He bought them a new car, a sturdy, safe SUV, and taught Gerald how to drive it, a task that involved much laughter and a few close calls with the mailbox. Life was becoming a series of small, beautiful victories. One evening, as they sat on the expansive wraparound porch watching the fireflies dance over the lawn, Gerald turned to Thomas. "You know, son, I spent a lot of nights in that shack wondering if I'd done something wrong. I wondered if I'd been a bad father, and that's why you never came back. I thought maybe I'd failed you somehow." Thomas reached out and gripped his father's hand, his voice thick with emotion. "You never failed me, Dad. You gave me the wings to fly, and the only reason I stayed away so long was because I wanted to make sure I could give you the world when I returned. The failure was never yours. It was the world's for letting people like Valerie thrive, while people like you suffered." They sat in silence for a long time, and the only sound being the chirping of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. It was a moment of absolute crystalline clarity, a realization that the bond of family, though stretched thin by distance and distorted by lies, was ultimately unbreakable. The day of the final court hearing arrived with a heavy, overcast sky that promised rain. Thomas, Martha, and Gerald drove to the courthouse in Lincoln, their expressions somber but determined. Valerie was there, looking thin and desperate, her expensive clothes now looking slightly frayed at the edges. Her lawyer, Sterling, tried to argue that the transfer of the house was an act of coercion, but Diana Thorne was ready. She presented the 15 years of bank records, the testimony from the postmaster about the intercepted letters, and finally, she played the recording Thomas had made at the landfill. The courtroom was silent as Valerie's voice filled the space, admitting to her envy and her theft. The judge, a stern man with 30 years on the bench, didn't even wait for the defense to finish their closing statement. He dismissed Valerie's claim with prejudice and ordered that the matter be turned over to the district attorney for immediate criminal prosecution. As they walked out of the courthouse, Valerie tried to stop them on the steps. "Martha, please, I'm your sister. You can't let them put me in jail." Martha stopped and looked at the woman she had shared a childhood with. There was no anger in Martha's eyes, only a profound, hollow sadness. You weren't my sister when you watched me eat dirt, Valerie. You weren't my sister when you let my son believe we were dead to him. I forgive you, because my heart is too full of love for my boy to hold on to hate for you. But forgiveness doesn't mean you don't face the harvest of what you sowed. Valerie collapsed onto the stone steps, weeping, as the Millers walked to their car and drove away. The legal saga was finally over, and the path ahead was clear. Back at the house, they celebrated with a quiet dinner. Thomas had decided to move his business interests to Nebraska, purchasing a local firm so he could stay near his parents permanently. He no longer felt the need for the bright lights of Chicago or the prestige of the big city. He had found his purpose in the quiet rhythms of the prairie, and he spent his mornings working from the home office and his afternoons helping his father in the garden or driving his mother to her various social clubs in Lincoln, where she was finally being treated like the lady she had always been. The shadow of the landfill began to recede, replaced by the vibrant colors of the life they were building together. As the months turned into a year, the story of the lottery son and the stolen years became a legend in the county. But Thomas made sure it was a legend about redemption, not just wealth. He used a portion of his winnings to establish a foundation for elderly people in Nebraska who had fallen through the cracks of the system, ensuring that no one else would ever have to live in a shack near a landfill because they lacked a voice. He became a guardian of the forgotten, a man who understood that the true value of money wasn't in what it could buy, but in what it could protect. And every evening, without fail, he would sit on the porch with Martha and Gerald, watching the sun dip below the horizon, feeling the immense, quiet power of a family that had been lost and was finally, truly found. Looking back on the long, winding road that brought me here, I've come to realize that life is rarely about the grand gestures or the sudden strokes of luck we all dream of. Yes, the lottery was a miracle, a bolt of lightning that changed my bank account, but it wasn't what saved my soul. The real miracle was the stubborn, quiet love that survived 15 years of silence. For the older generation, those of us who have seen the seasons turn more times than we care to count, there is a profound truth we eventually learn. The heart has its own memory, one that is far more resilient than the mind. We spend so much of our youth chasing things, success, money, status, only to find that in the twilight of our years, the only thing that actually carries any weight is the quality of the people standing beside us when the sun begins to set. I watched my parents endure the unendurable, their spirits crushed by a betrayal that should have broken them entirely. And yet, when they looked at me, they didn't see the suit or the car or the millions. They saw the boy who used to catch grasshoppers in the Nebraska heat. That is the essence of a life well lived, to be known, truly known, and loved anyway. As we grow older, we must learn the difficult art of discernment and to know the difference between those who offer us bread and those who offer us a home. Valerie offered them bread, but she stole their home. She offered them survival, but she robbed them of their life. We must be vigilant against the Valeries of the world, those who use our vulnerability to feed their own shadows, but we must also be open to the possibility of return. No matter how long the absence, no matter how deep the silence, there is always a path back to the people who matter, provided we are willing to walk it with honesty and a heart stripped of pride. The most important lesson I can share with anyone who has walked a long road is this: do not wait for a lottery win to reclaim your family. Oh, do not wait for a crisis to speak the truths that have been buried under years of "I'll do it tomorrow." Time is the only currency we can never earn back once it's spent. I lost 15 years with my mother and father, Years of birthdays and quiet mornings, and shared burdens that I can never reclaim. Those years are gone, swallowed by the greed of a woman and the distance of a city. But I have today. And today, I can choose to be the man they believe I am. I can choose to use my strength to shield their weakness and my voice to tell their story. For the seniors who are listening, know that your value is not measured by your utility or your wealth, but by the legacy of love you leave in the hearts of those you raised. And for the children who have wandered far, remember that the road home is always open, if only you have the courage to turn the wheel. In the end, we are all just walking each other home, and if we can do it with a little more grace and a lot more truth, then we have truly won the greatest prize of all.